Section 5.1, Percent, Fraction, and Decimals. This video will help you convert a percent to a decimal and a fraction, convert a fraction to a decimal and a percent, and then finally convert a decimal into both a percent and a fraction. So percents, fractions, and decimals are used to represent and calculate parts of a whole. We have all three because each is better suited for a different real-world situation. Since they're all part of a whole, they often represent the same amounts, and their values can be interchanged. So it's important to be able to convert from one form to another and also recognize the commonly occurring percent, fraction, and decimal numbers. So let's start with percent. So the definition of a percent, per, this prefix indicates division. Cent, that word means 100. So when we have the phrase percent, it's used in the place of per 100 or out of 100. Let's take a look at an example here that'll help you understand this. So example 1, shade 46% of the big square. And then we're also going to write 46% as a decimal number and then as a fraction. Well, let's start by shading it. So we want to shade 46%, which means this, 46 out of 100. And so this big square right here is 10 by 10. We got 10 going across this way, 10 going across this way. So what that tells us then is that there are 100 little squares in this big square here. And so we want to shade 46 out of 100. Well, let's see. So I'll shade down here. There's 10, 20, 30, 40, and now I just want to shade 6. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there we've shaded 46% of the square. Now we also want to write 46% as a decimal number and then write as a fraction. Well, let's start as a fraction because I already have it written as a fraction, 46 out of 100. There's our fraction. Now, we can write this then as a decimal number. So remember 46 hundredths, that's the same as 0.46. Because notice our last place value there, the 6, is in the hundredths place. So I would read that decimal number exactly the same way, 46 hundredths. Now this fraction, let's go one more step here with this fraction, because this fraction, 46 hundredths, needs to get simplified. Big numbers like this, if they're both even, I usually divide by 2, which would just essentially cut these numbers in half. So if I divide the top by 2, or cut 46 in half, that would give me 23. Cut 100 in half, and I'll get 50. Now 23 is a prime number. The only way I could simplify this fraction anymore is if 23 goes into 50 evenly, which it does not. So here's my fraction number for 46%. That's the fraction equivalent. And for 46%, there's my decimal equivalent. One more thing to note here. Notice I wrote the 0 in front of the decimal place. And just get in the habit of doing that, especially if you're going into the health fields. We always want to write that 0 in front so everybody can recognize that decimal. Let's take a look at another example here. Asked to shade 132% of the big square. And then write 132% as a decimal and also as a mixed number. Well, 100%, remember, means the whole thing. So if I were to shade 100% of this, that whole thing would be shaded. So notice, to shade 132%, we're going to need more than one whole object. So just starting out with, there's 100%. Now I need to shade over here 32%. And so let's see, there's 10, 20, 30, 2. So again, notice 132%, we've gone more than one whole thing here. And we've gone past that now, so we have 100 whole thing shaded plus 32% more shaded. All right, now let's write 132% as a decimal. This is pretty simple to do again. Notice 132% means this, 132 out of 100. Well, dividing something by 100, all that's going to do is move our decimal place 2 places to the left, making the number smaller. So in 132, our decimal starts right here. Dividing by 100 is going to move that 2 places to the left. So that's just going to give us 1.32 as our decimal number. Now let's take a look at 132% as a fraction. I think we'll start it out now as an improper fraction. But we're going to need to write this thing now as a mixed number. So let's see. 100 will go into 132 one whole time with a remainder of 32 hundredths. And now let's just go ahead and simplify that 32 hundredths. So this will be 1 and, let's see, looking for the greatest common factor here in both 32 and 100. I know that 4 is going to go into both of these. There might be something more, but I know that 4 is going to go into both of those. So I'm going to go ahead and divide a 4 out of there. When I divide a 4 out of 32, it'll leave me with 8. And when I divide a 4 out of 100, it's going to leave me with 25. I know that because there's 4 quarters in a dollar. Let's see, 1 and 8/25. 8 common factors in 8 are just 2. Not common factors, but factors in 8 are just really just 2. Here, just 5. So there's nothing more to simplify there. So there is my final mixed number for 132% is actually 1 and 8/25. And 132% as a decimal is just 1.32. Go ahead now and pause your video player and answer these practice questions. When you're done, hit play to see how you did. All right, question 3. Shade 25% of the big square. All right, we'll stop right there. Let's go ahead and shade 25%. So here's 10, here's 20. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, so a little bit more there. There's 5. So shading in something like this for 25%. Now let's go ahead and write 25% as a decimal number and then as a fraction. So let's see, 25%. Well, that means 25 out of 100. To write this as a decimal, dividing 25 by 100 is going to take that decimal and move it 2 places to the left. So I should get 0.25 or 25 hundredths as my decimal number. Now let's see, 25% as a fraction. Well, that's 25 out of 100 again. And now let's just simplify this as we would a fraction. Notice 25 goes into itself and it goes into 100. 25 goes into itself 1 time. 25 goes into 100 4 times. So 25% is just going to simplify down to 1/4. Question 4. Shade 210% of the big square and then write 210% as a decimal and as a mixed number. All right, well, let's start with 210%. So every one of these big squares is 100%. So I'm going to need to shade in 2 of these altogether. So there's 100%. There's 200%. Now I want to go 210, so that would just be 1 extra line here. There's 210% shaded. Now let's write 210% as a decimal number. So 210% is the same as 210 over 100. Well, let's see here. So I'm going to get 100 goes into 210. It goes in there 2 whole times with 10 out of 100 left over. Just thinking about this in terms of the fractions. Well, and then 10 out of 100, 10 hundredths. Well, we can simplify 10 hundredths just by dividing out a 1 there. That's 2 and 1/10. Well, as a decimal, then that's 2.10. The other thing that we can do here, and I'm just used to you working with fractions here, another easier or quicker way to get to this is just do the division. You know, 210 divided by 100, especially if your instructor's letting you use a calculator. Just do 210 divided by 100 and you'll get straight to this answer, 2.10 there. Okay, now 210% as a mixed number. And that's essentially what I did up here. You know, 100 goes into 210 2 whole times with a remainder of 10 hundredths left over. So let's see, that would be 2. And again, dividing a 10 out of each of these, which is just, in a sense, gets rid of the 0 on the end, that would be 2 and 1/10 as a mixed number. Now let's take a look at some more examples here where we'll start with a fraction and then convert those to both a decimal number and a percent. Okay, example 5. Shade 7/20 of the big square. Convert 7/20 to a decimal number and a percent. Well, to shade 7/20 of a big square, that's going to be a little difficult because I got 100 boxes here. I think we're going to be better off just writing 7/20 as a percent. So let's see, I got 7/20. I want to write this as a percent, meaning I want to write this out of 100. So this is very similar to building like fractions. If I can get this denominator to be 100, I'll have my percent. And so you can see starting at 20, what should I multiply by to get to 100? That's 5. So if I take the top and the bottom times 5, I'm going to get my percent. So 35 out of 100 is 35%. And this 35 out of 100 is going to make it now easy for me to shade the correct amount of squares. So I got 100 squares here. I want to shade 35 of them. So there's 10, 20, 30, 5. All right, so I've got my shaded. I've got my percent. Now let's talk about writing this thing as a decimal. So 7/20ths. I think the easiest way to do this is just take 20 and divide it into 7. And you have a calculator. Instructor should be letting you use a calculator here. So we're going to go ahead and do that division. If you get 20 divided by 7, you will get the decimal number 0.35. Another way we come up with the decimal equivalent of that is start here at our percent and move the decimal 2 places to the left. And we could have got right to that answer as well without doing the division. So either way, either path you take there would be fine. All right, let's take a look at example 6. Shade 2 1/5 of the big squares. Then convert 2 1/5 to a decimal number and a percent. All right, let's see. Well, 2, the whole number 2 is just going to be 2 whole things, just like when we had 200% was 2 whole things. So we got 2 whole things here. Then I want to shade 1/5 of this. Well, if I divided this into 5 parts, let's see. Yeah, that's a little tricky. Let's go ahead and write 1/5 as a percent. So let's just focus on 1/5. Turn that into a percent, meaning out of 100. Let's see, starting with 5, trying to get to 100, that missing multiplier is 20. So that's going to give me 20 out of 100, or the same thing there, 20%. So that just means 2 of these columns need to get shaded. All right, well, I've already got my percent there. Now let's talk about writing this as a decimal number. Well, I think it's pretty easy to start right here and turn that into a decimal number. 2 out of 100, or sorry, 20 out of 100, 20 hundredths. That's just 0.20. Now, a decimal number, we could also simplify this even more. 20 out of 100, that's the same as 2/10. And we could simply take the 0 off the end of our decimal number here to get 2/10, or you could go back up here to this fraction here, 20 out of 100, and see that you could divide a 10 out of each of those and still end up with 2/10 there to write it as a decimal number. Go ahead now, pause your video player and answer these practice questions. When you're done, hit play to see how you did. All right, question 7. Shade 3/25 of the big square, and then we want to convert it to a decimal and a percent. Let's see, I think before we shade 3/25 there, let's go ahead and get this thing as a percent again. To have a percent, we got to be out of 100. So I'm thinking 25 times what is going to get to me to 100? Well, that's 4. So my missing multiplier there is 4. So that's equal to 12 hundredths. That's just 12%. All right, 12 out of 100. I got 100 squares here, so I just need to shade 12 of them. There's 10. 2 more, that's 12. Okay. Now I want to write this also. I've got my percent. I want to write this as a decimal number. Let's start right here, 12 hundredths, because that translates directly to a decimal number. That is just like this, 12 out of 100. There's my decimal number. All right, practice question 8. Shade 1 2/5 of the big square. Well, 1's pretty easy. That's the whole thing. So I'm going to shade 1 whole thing. Now let's talk about changing 2/5 into a percent. So we want this to be out of 100. Let's see, starting with 5, getting to 100, well, that's just 20 again. So that's 40 hundredths. So when I come over here to shade, I want to shade 40 of those boxes. So there's 10, 20, 30, and then one more will be 40. All right, let's write this thing then as a percent. Notice, and all I did do here, all I changed here was the 2/5 part of this. So this isn't the whole thing here that's going on. So I know that this part right here is 40%, the 2/5, because 40 over 100 is equal to 40%. And I know that one whole thing is equal to 100%. So all I'm going to do to quickly do this, and I'm showing you all these calculations just to kind of show you what I'm thinking in my mind, but in my mind I can do this very quickly because I can think this way. So hopefully you'll be able to catch on to the way I'm thinking here. You know, one whole thing is equal to 100%. We know that 2/5 was equal to 40%. So 1 and 2/5 is just equal to 140%. Now let's talk about changing 140% now into a decimal number. Remember, 140%, that means this. That means out of 100. 140% means 140 out of 100. Well, to get our decimal answer, all we got to do is divide by 100. And what that's going to do, dividing by 100, will move this decimal place 2 to the left. So 1, 2. So 1 and 2/5 as a decimal number is going to be 1.4. All right, let's take a look at an example now where we'll start with a decimal and then convert that to percent and fraction. All right, let's see. Example 9, shade 0.56, or in this case 56 hundredths of the big square. Well, 56 hundredths. Here's what that means. 56 out of 100, which is perfect because we have 100 squares here, so all we have to do to shade that is shade 56 of these things. So there's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 6. Okay. Convert it to a percent. Well, we've got it right here. Look at 56 out of 100. Well, that's just 56%. We also could have done this, you know, to make this conversion. We could have said, okay, going decimal to percent, we're going to move the decimal just 2 places to the right, and that also could have got us to 56%. But I kind of like to write this one in between because this really helps me understand what's going on and helps me remember that a percent means just that number out of 100. Okay, let's see. We've got our decimal number, we've got our percent number. Now we need to get our fraction. So let's go here again, 56 hundredths, and let's just write this as a fraction. So 56 out of 100. Let's go ahead and simplify this. Big numbers again. Both of them are even, so I'll divide a 2 out of each of these to kind of cut them in half. Let's see, when I cut 56 in half, that is going to be 28. And when I cut 100 in half, that is going to be 50. They're still even, so I can go ahead and simplify this again. I'll go ahead and just cut them in half again and see what happens. When I cut 28 in half, I'll get 14. 50, when I cut that in half, I'll get 25. I'm not going to be able to simplify this anymore. My factors with 14 are 2 and 7. My factors with 25 are 5 and 5. So there's no more common factors here. So there is my simplified fraction. And here is my percent. Go ahead and pause your video player now and answer these practice questions. When you're done, hit play to see how you did. All right, question 10. Shade 0.9 or 9/10 of the big square. Then we want to make some conversions. Well, let's start right here. 0.9/10. So that's equal to the fraction 9/10. I think we're going to turn this into a percent because it'll make it easier to shade these squares in. So let's see, we're kind of starting with 9/10. Percent means out of 100. So I want to get that denominator to be 100. So I'm just, the missing multiplier here is just going to be 10. So that would be 90 out of 100, which is almost the whole thing shaded in, except for that last column. And that makes sense because we're talking about 90%. We're talking about almost one whole thing. So we shade that in. There's 90%. Now we also want to write this as a fraction in simplest form. Well, it's nice. 9/10. There was 9/10 right here. So if we bring that 9/10 down and think about simplifying it, well, the factors in 9 are just 3 times 3. Factors in 10 are 2 times 5. So these don't share any common factors at all. So that fraction is in its simplest form. So let's see. 90 out of 100, there was our percent. It was 90%. There's our fraction, 9/10. And our decimal form 9/10, and then here it is shaded. All right, let's take a look at question 12. Shade 2.20 of the big square. Well, 2 is 2 whole things. So I want to shade in 2 whole things to start with. Now I have this 20.20. So let's just look at that. Think about shading that in. Well, that means, in this case, 20 hundredths. So that means 20 out of 100. So that will tell us that we need to shade 2 columns here. Shade 20 more. So now we've got it shaded. There's 2, and then decimal point basically, and then 20 hundredths over here for this spot. Now let's talk about writing this as a percent. So 2.20, well, this should be pretty easy. 2, the whole number 2 is 200%. Remember, each of these things shaded is 100%. So the whole number 2 is just 200%. And then we already said this 20 hundredths means 20 out of 100. So this thing is really set up for percent. So this is just going to be 220%. Another way to do this, we're going from decimal to percent. You could have just moved this decimal 2 places to the right to come up with that calculation. But I kind of like to think it through with the pictures there. All right, now the other thing we need to do, we've got a percent here. We want to list this now as a fraction. So 2 and 20 hundredths. Well, that's pretty easy. All we have to do is read this decimal number by not saying, 2.20, but actually read its values. This would be 2 and, so that indicates this is going to be our fraction part, 20 hundredths. And now let's just simplify that 20 hundredths. So 2 and, notice both of these numbers end in 0. That means I could divide a 10 out of those. So that leaves me with 2/10, and I can simplify 2/10. There's a common factor of 2 in each of those, so that would just be 2 and 1/5 as my final simplified form of that fraction.